Hello, and thanks for watching. In this video, we're going to be taking a tour of the Tinkercad interface and viewing some basic object manipulation and controls in Tinkercad. So I've logged into Tinkercad and I have my dashboard here and all sorts of designs that I've done in the past. We're going to click on Create New Design, so plus new up here. And we're going to do a 3D design. Tinkercad does have options for circuits and code blocks, but for us, the 3D design area is where we're going to be spending the vast majority of our time. Feel free to explore some of those other items as well if you want. Now, the interface in Tinkercad is broken up into a few different parts. Your work plane might look a little different than mine, depending on the default settings you've got. But we're going to go through the interface and how to kind of adjust the work plane so that we can take a look together at all of those different aspects. Now, in the upper left-hand corner, there are a few icons. These relate to the view of the actual camera right now. The Tinkercad logo up in the top left will take you back to the dashboard. The next is a box with bullets, and you can see your recent designs as well as create new designs. So it's kind of like a file menu. And then finally on here is a default name, and it kind of generates a randomly selected name for your project, but you can modify that. So Tinkercad demo video, for example. And that will make it so that in your file list, it has a little bit more of a recognizable name for you when you're looking for what you're doing. All right. When we are looking at the workspace and our icons here, one of the first things is to really understand how the viewport works and how you can manipulate what you're looking at. So if you've been playing around with your mouse in Tinkercad at all, you might have already noticed that by right-clicking, you can kind of tilt around and orbit around your actual work plane. And if you middle-click, which is the scroll wheel on most mouses, you can pan the actual view of things. Now, there's also this view cube, which is really handy because you can click and drag from different points. So I can grab from this corner, and that will help me orbit around there. Or again, if I move to a different corner or an edge, or even a whole side. And that just lets me manipulate the viewport based on how I'm moving this cube around. You can also single click on some of these to get a quick view from that perspective. So I want to look at the view plane from top down. I can just hit top, and it completely flattens the view. So I don't have to kind of worry about trying to angle it correctly. The view cube really is super helpful for looking at particular views based on where you click and select. Finally, there's the home view, which similar to Cura, gives you kind of a default view setting. And then there is a focus or fit it all in view, which is also the hotkey F. So let me just drag a few objects to the work plane here so that we can see what that will do. I'm just going to resize this really quick because my work plane is very small. And we'll get to resizing objects and stuff in a minute, but just it's much easier to show the view controls if I've got some objects to actually view. All right, so I've got two objects on my view plane. If I select one of my objects and I either click the fit to view or I hit F, the hotkey F, it basically centers on that single object, but from the same perspective my camera currently is, right? So if I move around to the back and select this and focus or fill to view, it selects or it zooms in on that one object, which is really handy when you want to kind of make modifications for a specific object. If you have multiple objects selected though, so let's say I'll select both my objects here and hit fill, it just centers the two of them, or as many objects as you've got selected in your view pane. So again, this is a really handy tool of quickly seeing where your objects are and what they're going to be, or focusing in on those specific objects that you are wanting to manipulate. Okay, so that's home view and focus view. The next two items on here are just straight up zoom in and zoom out. You can also use the keyboard commands plus and minus for this, and you can use your scroll wheel in most cases as well. I tend to use the scroll wheel for zooming. It's again, but there's no right way or wrong way here, whatever you're comfortable with when it comes to the view. Now, the last option here is orthographic view. This is something that it's a bit of an advanced function. You're not going to be using it probably early on in the course, but it is helpful in some cases, particularly if you're trying to judge sizes together. So we'll get to that in a future lab, but for now, you probably don't need orthographic view. You probably want to stay in your perspective view most of the time, not in the flat view that orthographic view offers. All right, so talking about other areas on the interface, you'll probably also have noticed that whenever I select one of these objects, we get this dialog box that comes up, and it has a bunch of information about the object that I've selected. So it has things like the color, which we can change. I can recolor this cube, for example. It also has this thing called whole, and we'll get to that in a future video. It's a super important function, but it's not something we need to worry about too much right now. And then finally, it's got details about the actual shape itself. Now, depending on the shape, those details will change as to what attributes are available there. For the cube, you've got your radius, your steps, your length, width, and height. And you can manipulate them using this panel, or you can manipulate it using the handles that are shown here. For the sphere, all it has is the steps, and the steps essentially are these little facets that you see in here. So if we increase our steps, it makes that sphere higher resolution essentially. And if you decrease it, it makes it a simpler shape. So again, depending on which particular object you've got selected, these will actually change. And you can use that to your advantage to manipulate how things are being done. The other important thing about this is when you have selected a shape, you'll also notice that the measurement is shown here. One of the things that kind of annoys me about Tinkercad is that in the dialog panel, the measurements shown are that of the default object when it's dragged onto the build area. Which means that if you've resized your object, these actual measurements are no longer valid. You need to actually select the object itself to see what the measurement actually currently is. So right now, this cube is 7 by 7 by 7. And you can click to kind of see that, as well as the height. And you can manipulate it in the actual dialog settings here. So if I want to make it a little bit taller, I might put it in as 10, for example. If I want to make it a little bit wider, I might put it in as 9, and so on and so forth. So you're able to click on these different measurements inside the view area and manipulate the dimensions of the object. Same thing with the sphere here. Maybe we're going to round that off to 8.5, and that will adjust the sizing of it. Remember, though, that if you're only adjusting a single dimension, you may need to, if you want to keep it, for example, a symmetrical sphere, you might need to adjust the other sides to a similar amount. You can also click and drag the handles to do that too. If you hold Shift and drag the handles, it will automatically change all the dimensions, whereas if you don't hold Shift, it lets you kind of skew and shape your object. But it does show you that readout, the numeric readout of what the shape is. Now, I've currently got the snapping on this set to 1 millimeter increments. So you'll notice that when I move it, for example, it goes from 8 to 9, etc. We'll get into snapping and grids in a few minutes. So those are the basic manipulation controls of these shapes. The other important controls are, for example, the Z-axis little arrow, which lets you move it off of your build surface. And you can drop it back down to the build surface by just selecting the object and hitting D. That brings it back down to your build plane. So if you've got something that you want it to be on the actual build surface and you're not sure, maybe it's only, like sitting like this, and you're not sure if it's actually floating or on the side, you can hit D and it will drop it back down to the build surface. Okay, so that's how to size your objects and kind of manipulate their shape. The other important thing is rotation. So if we select on a single aspect, you get these little handles here. and you can rotate your object. By default, it goes in, what increment is that? About 22.5 degree increments. If you hold shift, it'll do it in 45 degree increments. So you can manipulate the actual positioning, but it just depends on how specific you want to get. If you drag, if you need more fine-tuned shifting or rotation, right? Move from the inner ring. See that inner ring is highlighted, the one that goes red when we move it, to the outer ring, and that will let you actually move it in very precise increments. And you can see the exact angle that I've rotated it on the end of that kind of red indicator stick. And that's available for all the different axes. So you can find one of those rotation dials on all of the different axes of the shape. Even a sphere like this, even though it doesn't really change, but you can kind of see those facets moving. Let me just focus in on that a little bit. You can see those facets being shifted around when we rotate our shape. So depending on how simple you've made your sphere in terms of steps, it's more or less noticeable. So I make it a very simple sphere, you can really see that rotation a little bit easier now. All right. Undo that, just get my objects reset. So continuing on with the actual interface options, when we've selected objects, we get a few of these icons highlighted up here, things like copy, paste, and duplicate. So these are all really common, and delete, of course. And in green, it shows you the hotkey equivalent. So copy and paste are Control-C, Control-V, just like in almost any other software. Duplicate is Control-D. And delete is the delete key. So very straightforward. And then you have your undo and redo steps as well. When we move over to the right-hand side, we have our notes visibility. And then we've got a few things that currently are not selected, but if I select multiple objects, for example, we get the option to group or Control-G. And then once we have a grouped object selected, we can ungroup. Now, notice that when I grouped it, the colors became uniform between the two. And that really is based on the order which you selected. If you select the cube first, or our cube shape first, and then the sphere, it basically sets the first object you select as the primary, and any attributes like color and stuff will be defined by that primary shape. Whereas if I select the sphere first and then the cube and group them together, it adopts again, the primary object. The first one I selected was the sphere, so the color of the sphere gets applied to both shapes that are grouped. But you can always ungroup and they'll revert to their original shape as well. Now, when I've got multiple objects selected, we also have an alignment panel that opens up, or alignment tool. And this is a really handy tool for when we're starting to merge and manipulate shapes together, because it lets us align them on different axes. So for example, if I want to center these two shapes, I can hit our center dot. And again, and my cube is a little bit too big to see the sphere, but as you can see, they're now completely centered. I can center them horizontally as well. So now these two objects are centered with one another on all axes. If I move something out, I can then recenter it using these commands, or maybe I want to align them along their baseline or along the top of the object or whatever else. So there's a bunch of different commands and controls that you can use in this to really, help you align two objects together in different fashions and manners. So again, if I want to have them both at the top level or centered, with the middle of each other. All right, undo all of that. Continuing along that same toolbar, we have our import, export, and send to functions. So import we would use if we're bringing in a secondary STL file, or if we're bringing in a vector shape. And we'll get into that in a future tutorial about exactly what that means and how we can use that to our advantage. Export is what we're going to use for downloading and 3D printing. So when we want to make our STL file from Tinkercad, we're going to export it using that button there. And then send to lets you, do a few different things depending on what it is. You can share to Google Classroom. You can post directly to Thingiverse. There's a bunch of neat things that you can do in the send. But again, not something that we'll be dealing with too much in this course. Below that, we have our work plane tool, ruler tool, and notes tool. Notes are basically just little comments that you can add to your actual object. The work plane tool we'll get into in a minute with the settings, and rulers are really for more precise measurements and details, which we'll also be talking about in kind of future tutorials and how those can be used. Below that, you've got your different libraries. So it starts off with the default basic shape library, but there's a number of other libraries in here. Now, we'll typically start with basic shapes because you need to get a good handle of how to use these before you really get into some of the other more detailed tools. You can also collapse this entire panel if you're just manipulating objects, in your actual model. You might not need to be dragging new shapes into the work area, so you can actually close that up entirely. You'll still get the dialog box for the individual objects when you select them. You just won't have that space taken up on the right by shapes if you've got all the elements you need already on your work setting or your work plane. All right, so let's talk about the work plane in general. Now, I mentioned before that your work plane probably looks a little bit different than this one because the settings on this one, when I set up this file, were a little bit different by default. This was set up as a 20 millimeter by 20 millimeter work plane. I believe the default for Tinkercad is actually 200 by 200. So your work plane probably looked something more like this when you started off. And those objects look teeny tiny by comparison. And that's also when I brought those shapes in, they brought in at a more reasonable size relative to the work plane. Now, it's really common to modify your work plane to match your 3D printer if you've got a particular 3D printer. So again, we're dealing mostly with the artillery sidewinder. So you may wish to change your work plane to 300 millimeters by 300 millimeters, which is the size of the build area of that 3D printer. And then you can make that the default so that every time you load a new project, that's what it comes in at. You can also turn off the grid and the shadows if you find that they're bothering you. You can change the zoom speed if you, again, find it's too fast or too slow. And you can even change the units. Now, I really recommend sticking with millimeters, and there's a few reasons for that. One, the metric system is just better than imperial. It's much easier to deal with tenths or rather units that are divisible by 10 versus the 1/8, 1/4, 7/8 nonsense of imperial inches. But if you are working with a particular design or project where it has to be accurate in imperial, maybe you want to change your units to match that. For me, millimeters is more comfortable. It's a little bit easier, and that's how we measure the build area of the artillery sidewinder anyway. So millimeters is a good default for myself. Also, again, when we talk about STL files, the default unit of measurement for STL files is millimeters as well. So you'll find that most 3D items are designed in millimeters. Finally, once you're happy with all of this, you can set make default so that anytime I make a new project, it will bring in that default 300 millimeter by 300 millimeter work plane. There we go. Below the settings for the work plane is your snap grid. Now, your snap grid is essentially where objects will move in increments by default. So if I have a cube and I move it, by default right now, it's going to move 1 millimeter at a time because my snap grid is set to 1 millimeter. If I set it to 5 millimeters, it'll jump in 5 millimeter increments, right? And same thing with our general sizing. Now that I've set my snap grid to 5 millimeters, it will move every time I move or drag the cursor, it'll move in 5 millimeter increments. So I'm going from 20 millimeters to 25 millimeters to 30 millimeters. This is something that you're going to manipulate depending on the size of the object that you're creating. If I'm creating something for an FDM print or an FFF print, 1 millimeters is generally okay, although if I'm doing some fine details, I might move that snap grid down. If I'm doing something for an SLA print, though, a resin print, I might move it down to half, quarter, or even 0.1 millimeter, depending on the level of detail and the size of the object I'm creating. You can also turn snapping off entirely if you want a completely free-form type of manipulation, but again, I would recommend either 1 millimeter or half millimeter for most of our projects, but you might want to, make adjustments to that when you're actually in a specific project. All right, the last thing I'm going to talk about briefly in this video before we get into specific project examples is how to use this whole object or these whole shapes that are available to us. Now, I will say that this box and cylinder whole shape are kind of a throwback to when an earlier version of Tinkercad. At this point, you can change any of the shapes here into a whole shape, so you really don't need to ever use these two objects. And what a whole shape is it basically creates a negative space in another shape. So if I wanted to, for example, let's say make an archway out of this rectangle. So I might size it up like that, and then I might take a shape. Let's take this cone here, or no, here, this round roof. Okay, and I'm just going to kind of place it loosely. This is obviously not very precise. Okay, and so I've got my two shapes overlapping, and at this point, if I wanted to essentially cut out that round roof from my cube, I can set this to be a hole. Okay. Now, while the objects are independent, I can still move them around, right? But again, if my goal here is to make an archway, I will probably want to select the two of them and group them. Now, once I've grouped them, my whole shape disappears, and the void that it created is now part of that other shape. Now, one of the interesting things about Tinkercad is that while this looks now like a independent shape, it still is actually composed of those two subcomponents, that rounded roof and that cube, or what was a cube originally, but I've reshaped it. So if I ungroup it, I can then again, remanipulate that one piece. So maybe, I want to make my arch a little bit wider with thinner legs on it, right? So you can always kind of undo and go back and make adjustments as long as you recognize that your shape has been grouped. And you can tell the shape's been grouped because the ungroup option is now available whenever we select it. Whereas if we have just a regular cube here, there's nothing to ungroup there, that's not highlighted. So whole shapes are really handy for making, basically making a negative shape out of another shape. And it doesn't have to be completely overlapped like this. You can, perhaps you're doing something where you just need to kind of trim away part of the side of this shape. So we set our cylinder here to be a hole, and then select those two objects, group them together. Now I've made this kind of, more organic shape based on this. Let me just hit focus to zoom in on that. So I kind of cut away part of that shape. And this is really one of the most powerful tools and easiest to use once you get used to it in Tinkercad, because it lets you combine shapes as both positive elements or negative elements to add or remove, to add or subtract elements of your actual objects. And we're going to be using that a lot in our different examples throughout the course. And it's definitely one of the handiest ways and easiest ways to take a basic shape and make it a little bit more interesting, make it a little bit more unique and dynamic. Thanks for watching.